to this year's Institute on World Affairs, Eastern Europe and the World in Transition. And I would like to invite everyone to attend the entire week's events. This evening at 8, Gail Lapidus will speak on the rise of nationalism and ethnic conflicts here in the Pioneer Room. And Dr. Kopansky will be speaking at noon tomorrow on Islam and Muslims of Eastern Europe, an amorphous of religious identity. This afternoon's lecture, The New Europe, Politics and New Social Movements, will be presented by Diana Johnstone. Ms. Johnstone received a doctorate in French literature from the University of Minnesota, where she was active in the campus movement against the war in Indochina, and later organized the first contacts between American citizens and Vietnamese representatives in Paris. She has been the editor of In These Times since 1979 and is the author of The Politics of Euromissiles, Europe's Role in America's World. Presently, she has taken a leave of absence to serve as the press attaché for the Greens of the European Parliament. Ms. Johnstone?
Well, hello. I'm going to make a shorter presentation today than I did last night, in case any of you are veterans of the night before, on the subject of new social movements, and then hope to open up to questions. The 70s and 80s were characterized by the decline of the labor movement and a certain flowering of what are called the new social movements, notably the women's movement, the peace movement, and the environmental movements. The decline of the labor movement and the rise of these new movements, especially the peace movement, were symptomatic of a certain disintegration of the post-war world. The European peace movement of the 80s was, to a very large degree, symptomatic of growing exasperation with the Soviet-American peace that took the form of a Cold War. A Cold War that, in the end, has proved ruinous to both the superpowers and has left the world in disastrous shape. The West German movement against the stationing of mass destruction weapons on its territory was the most influential movement of the 80s. The paradox of the German peace movement is that its greatest success took place in Moscow. The intellectual arguments developed in and around the German peace movement were heard and eventually echoed by the intellectual elite around Gorbachev. At the same time, the image of a new peaceful Germany that was projected by the mass peace movement helped break down the real fear of German militarism that existed in Eastern Europe. This was a crucial factor in creating a public mood that allowed Gorbachev's opening toward Germany, leading more rapidly than anyone could have imagined to the collapse of communism and the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe and to the unification of Germany. Success has weakened the peace movement. Narrowly focused on the threat of nuclear war in Europe between the superpowers, the European peace movement has not yet, anyway, been revived by the Gulf crisis, although this could happen, I think, very rapidly, even to the extent that the American peace movement seems to be reviving. Clearly, there is a feeling that the disarmament process must be continued, taking in the North-South dimension, which means putting an end to arms exports. But there is as yet no real movement in this sense. The peace movement of the 80s was different from earlier peace movements, which were mainly animated by religious or political militants, especially Christian or communist of some sort. Certainly religious convictions and political perspectives played a role in the peace movement of the 80s, but what was new was a strong independent intellectual component, the critique of mass destruction weapons. This critique was often quite detailed and technical, and can be seen as part of the growing social and ecological critique of technology, which is the basis of the Green Movement. Here we can observe a difference between the new social movements and those that preceded them. the absence of any organizational link between the intellectual centers of the movement and the mass base that may be mobilized for demonstrations. The old social movement par excellence was the labor movement, and its strength lay in its social and even organizational homogeneity. The labor movement was often able to bring out large numbers of people on various related issues. The labor movement is far from defunct, but the fact is that the collapse of communism in the East coincides with the decline of the industrial working class in the West, not only in numbers but in influence. This has to do with the loss of social homogeneity that once enabled factory workers, dockers, or miners to act together almost spontaneously. Also, the new technologies have been developed to replace, fragment, and control the industrial workforce. The new movements reflect the social fragmentation. When the mass movement ebbs, nobody knows where the masses have gone or how to call them back. Meanwhile, what is left of the movements, their leaders or thinkers, tend to disintegrate into what our jargon calls the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, which are like small businesses, sometimes no more than an office with 2 or 3 people. They network between each other, lobbying officials and the media. The NGOs seem to be the main form of militant democracy in the contemporary advanced countries. It is, I think, a fragile form which depends on donors and media goodwill. The traditional parties of the left have been trying to draw from the new social movement some of the strength they lost through the decline of the labor movement. These attempts have so far had only very limited success. One reason is that the new movements were to some extent formed in revolt against the established parties of the left. The Green parties of Europe are the political innovation of the 80s and mark the attempt to create a political arm of the new social movements, centering on the ecology movement, but including the women's movement, the peace movement, and what is called the radical democratic movement. That is, the broadest defense of individual and minority rights against the power of the state. The Green parties sprang up around 1980, first in West Germany and Belgium, and now exist in most European countries with more success in Northern than in Southern Europe, and now are springing up in Eastern Europe as well. The vote for Green parties reflects growing public concern and even alarm over the environmental crisis. Often the parties and candidates are scarcely known to the public who vote for them. They are voting for the issue. This means that the Green label is a valuable property, and in the second wave of Green parties in France, Italy, and other countries in the south of Europe, and perhaps this will happen in the East as well, the battle for the label can take precedence over the invention of green politics that took place in Germany at the beginning of the movement. There are several questions about the future of the Greens. What will be the relation between the electoral parties and the non-governmental organizations that are their original base? The grassroots movement, which are the base of the party, have been tending to become much smaller. Then how will they relate to still newer social movements, for instance, of foreign immigrants? And how will they relate to the old movements, the labor movement and the socialist left? There's also the question of the influence of Greens from Eastern Europe on the Greens in the West. And then finally, there is also the question of what institutional framework they'll be working in, which relates to the question of the future of the European community or other forms of European integration. And this is a question I already mentioned last night, which is a main question dividing the movement today. But at this point, I want to really open up to your questions and continue a discussion.
As I recall, in the most recent elections, the Greens in West Germany lost ground. Is that right?
Well, sometimes they lose and sometimes they gain. I mean, it's they've recently entered the government of Lower Saxony, which is a gain.
But I guess the trend did not seem to be upward, as I recall, actually. They lost seats in the...
Well, you know, every movement, when it starts out and it goes from nothing to 5%, it's like businesses. You draw an arrow and you say, well, at this rate, you know, in 10 years we'll have 25% and then, you know, 100% in 15 years. But those trends are always imaginary. So at the first, because it grows very much at first. Then there's great disappointment when it doesn't keep growing like that. But it has leveled off at something above the 5% needed to get into the Bundestag. And the polls now are showing around 7%. Well, the vote will tell. But that's about where it's always been, about 7-8%, with more in some places than others. And that just may mean that it has that much of an electorate and no more, and that there's no trend upward as everybody tends to think at the beginning of a new movement, but that in fact it represents a sizable minority which has a certain influence, but it's not going to be a majority. It can be part of coalitions in some cases. As I say, it's in the government of Lower Saxony in coalition with the Social Democratic Party, also the government of the City of Frankfurt and West Berlin, although that's coming to an end.
Well, has it peaked then in Germany, and perhaps it's on the rise in other countries?
That's the sort of question I really don't like to answer because I don't have any crystal ball and I cannot foresee the future.
Well, are these other issues beginning to, well, you mentioned immigrants, policy and immigrants.
The issue of environment is certainly becoming more and more of a central concern. But you see, whether or not this means a Green Party vote remains to be seen because the other parties are all talking about the environment too. So that's why it's really impossible to predict what will happen because it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on how convincing the other parties are with their environmental programs. Whether that just seems like a lot of talk, well then people are going to keep voting for the Greens. If the other parties really get serious about the environment, that will cause trouble for the Greens, but maybe that's a good thing. I mean, maybe then they'll have fulfilled their function. It doesn't matter so much as the issue.
Yeah. What I was hearing you say last night was that the changes that have happened in Eastern Europe were to some extent a product of the Green, say, the peace movement in East Germany. And then after the revolution, they found out that the mass of people were more interested in Western consumer goods than they were in the issues that had been raised. Can you say something about who the Greens are and if they do in fact have a mass base? Are they connected with most of the people, or are they sort of a party that works best in a totalitarian framework?
They work worse in a totalitarian framework because the Greens are much stronger in West Germany than in East Germany. And one of the problems of the Greens now is precisely that they are stronger in West Germany. And since they have to have 5% of the national vote, as long as they have to have 5% of the national vote, there was a fear that they would lose that because they're much weaker in Eastern Europe.
But I was hearing that they had pulled off, maybe in the numbers or something they're not that strong, but they pulled off an enormous coup. Or did I not hear that wrong?
Well,
East Germany.
those weren't the Greens. There were the demonstrations against the system that developed last year, leading to the opening of the Berlin Wall, right?
But okay, did I not hear this right? That I thought you said last night that the Greens were sort of at the base of that.
They were certainly had been cooperating with some of the activists. That's right. I mean, it was a connection with that. And as a matter of fact, the intellectuals who led those movements are now in an electoral alliance with the Greens. But it certainly isn't that they work better in an authoritarian system. because the Greens in the West have had a basis in West Germany of citizens' movements that had thousands and thousands of members. They had a real mass basis, the Die Grünen in West Germany. And in East Germany, it's not the case. It is the intellectuals in East Germany were a rather privileged class. I mean, writers and theater people and so on. And they went out and led these movements for change, to make a democratic social system. And they would not have succeeded, probably, if Gorbachev had not made it clear that the Soviet Union would not support the Honecker regime. So, in a sense, the unification of Germany was due primarily to Gorbachev, and a lot of Germans consider that that's the fact. Because the moment the Honecker regime could not count on support from the Soviet Union, and remember that the Soviet Union had hundreds of thousands of troops in East Germany, and those troops made it very clear that they would not intervene to uphold the regime, and even on the contrary, some of the demonstrators were expecting the Soviet troops to support so the regime collapsed because it no longer had Soviet backing. The intellectuals led this push to its collapse. Now, afterwards, they did quite poorly in the elections, and because they do not have a real social base, because they have not had mass organizations behind them. The most they had behind them to some extent were the churches, but the churches were almost used as a meeting place as much as anything else, the Protestant churches.
So interesting what you're saying, a bit baffling still to think about the rapid decline of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. Would you, and I don't mean to take us off focus, but would you please respond or talk a little bit about what you think the reasons for that rapid decline were? Was it really Gorbachev, or were there other things that caused that, things happening in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union itself?
Well, the program's going to have a much more qualified speaker on that subject, Gail Lapidus. So I have my opinion, but I'm sure she is much more able to speak on that. But I think that what they speak of, the stagnation, that's the Gorbachevian expression for the Brezhnev years, that there was a period of stagnation where the system simply did not innovate and became quite corrupt. And there was a tendency for people to pillage the state economy rather than to work for it. If you ever get to see Soviet films, they illustrate this very, very well. The tendency for workers to take home a piece of the equipment. And the feeling of there was certainly a corruption in the system, that it was collapsing from within. And finally, there are many factors, but the arms race played a role because the Soviet Union was placed with a choice of spending more and more money in an arms race or dropping out of it. And this is where I say the German peace movement, I think, was very important, because the real fear was always that Germany would become militaristic again and with NATO would invade the East. And the thought that there was a new generation in Germany and that Germany was no longer to be feared made it possible to say, no, we're not going to go on with this arms race. And that's why I think the German peace movement was the most influential because of that. And that the people around Gorbachev decided it was more worthwhile to drop the military empire in the East in hopes of getting German technology and German know-how. Because there is an historic relationship between Germany and Russia. And there is a great desire among the people around Gorbachev to revive that relationship between Russia and Germany. Catherine the Great was a German. There was a historic tradition of learning business, Wirtschaft, from the Germans. And the Russians have tremendous admiration for Germany. That is very, very striking. That is their model country. I've heard arguments between Russians and Germans, especially German Greens, who say, oh, it's so terrible here, you know, it's undemocratic, and so this and so that. And the Russians say, oh, don't tell me about it. This is wonderful. You have such culture in every town, and you know, in the Soviet Union, you go miles and miles. You have, you know, Leningrad and Moscow and Kiev, and after that, there's nothing. And Germany is really the model, and I think that the whole bet here is a bet on good relations with Germany.
Is the rest of Eastern Europe then a domino effect?
The rest of Eastern Europe is rather neglected in all of this at the moment.
But the fact that they were able to relieve themselves of the yoke of communism.
It's very nationalist. There was a great desire to get rid of the Russian dominance. So there's a very nationalist reaction in the other countries.
Could I sort of follow up on the last half of my question? Could you characterize the Greens in Germany as far as education and occupation and income?
Definitely. It's definitely considered that it's a party of the social of the third sector, of the service professions. The Greens are very, very much concentrated in the service professions. Teachers, pastors, nurses, the service sector. It's with a few exceptions. I mean, we have a farmer in the section and so on, but it's very much very clear sociological identity of the Green movement.
Highly educated too?
Well, that sort of goes with the service professions. I mean, that there's a high level of education.
Is it the ultimate objective of the Greens to gain political control of Germany and become the dominant government, or is it just a force that will try to influence the decisions?
Except for that initial euphoria that I speak of, when you see the arrow going up in the first few months, and you can project it upward forever and ever, I don't think there's much serious thought of being the government. But that's because there's a proportional system there, and politics isn't simply a matter of getting a majority and running a government. I mean, you can have a lot of influence and sometimes more influence in the opposition. This is very true in Germany, which has a federal system. And for instance, the SPD has been in the opposition for quite a while, but continues to have quite a considerable influence. And there's consultation. There's a lot of consultation between the majority and the minority in Germany. They have a very consensual politics, even though it can get rough like anywhere else. But the opposition is not thrust all the way out. And oppositions can certainly have influence. And often more. There's been an argument in the Greens, is it worthwhile to get into government at all? I think there are probably more people who don't even want to get into a government, because once you get into a government, if you're the smaller party, you do it on the other fellow's terms, which means that you give up your program. And in that way, it's usually better to stay in the opposition, because you can go on advocating what you really believe without having to water it down. So I don't think that running all of Germany can be described as... now, the British Greens, who are just getting started, say they want to be the British government. I think that's maybe you need that to tell yourself that when you're starting out and have from nothing.
Do you think Thatcher's days are numbered, or do you think that she'll continue to have a negative effect on the introduction of legislation?
Well, it's widely thought that her days are numbered, because her own Conservative Party is not too happy with her to a large extent, especially about Europe. Feel that she's always isolated in Europe.
well seen what crumbled and what's transformed to some extent in Eastern Europe and in Eastern Germany. And we can see that, as you were saying in the beginning, whatever they expected in terms of democracy, it turned out that people in Eastern Germany were after consumer goods in a lot of ways. A lot of what's going on throughout is a rejection of the Soviet presence, clearly, and some rejection of the authoritarianism that's in the local national states, too. But Eastern Germany isn't going to be able to become West Germany, right? They won't be able to simply become West Germans as far as their economics. They're not going to be able to get that for a long time, if ever. The third world is never going to be able to live like we live here, or there will be no ozone period. I mean, none of that can really happen. So we're aware of what we think ideally they might want, and we're seeing what practically, at least at first, they want. What's going to happen to West Germany, as it in fact now includes all of Germany? What are the West Germans likely to start picking up from the East that they don't have?
Well, the first thing they're likely to start picking up is the abortion law, because there was a huge controversy about the abortion law. And because abortion is legal in East Germany and not in West Germany.
It's illegal in West Germany.
Yes. And you see, generally, what happened is that all overnight, West German law is the law all over the place, which, when you think about it, I mean, since they had evolved for 45 years in such different directions, that is a chaotic situation. Because, for instance, you're in East Germany. All of a sudden, the law is West German law. There's not a lawyer in town who understands that law. You've got to go to a Western lawyer to figure that out. I mean, just think of the dependence that creates on all kinds of levels. Business law, etc. I mean, there is a period of chaos, but since the Germans are fairly orderly people, the chaos isn't as visible as it might be. But it is chaos. Now, the abortion law, there was a great deal of that was objection from women about this, and the Social Democrats objected to imposing the West German abortion law on the East. And remember, there's also a religious difference, because East Germany is traditionally Protestant, entirely Protestant, whereas the West German abortion law is the result of the Catholic influence of Southern Germany. So, I mean, aside from communism or capitalism, you also have a religious difference in Germany that goes back to Martin Luther and the Reformation. So there is now a transitional period where there are two abortion laws. They have retained the abortion law in East Germany. But there is a feeling that this has got to be renegotiated, and the women's organizations in the West want to use this to liberalize the abortion law in the West. So that's the first place, to answer your question very precisely, that's the first place where East Germany may influence. A second point also has to do with the women's situation. East Germany had an excellent day nursery network, daycare centers for children, because working mothers were very well taken care of in East Germany. Now, these daycare centers are shutting down because they were state subsidized, and everything is collapsing in East Germany because the state subsidies are being withdrawn. Nevertheless, that example is, a lot of women in the West say, well, we'd like something like this too. So that is another case where things may be adopted the other way.
I'm just wondering how much that's going to spread throughout all of Europe. As the Poles try to do it quickly, immediately, what happens when they have no law?
The European Parliament has been trying to get its word in on this process because, of course, East Germany has suddenly become a part of the European community, just like that. And so the European community is trying to digest this new member, and there have been long reports and debates and so on. And the official report said particularly that the rest of Europe should take up certain things from East Germany about women, in particular the daycare, and so that is already looked on by feminists certainly and progressive people in the rest of Europe as that there are good things in East Germany that they would like to copy.
I had a question about the Greens in Eastern Europe in general. I'd appreciate just a little survey of where they stand. I have an experience with Czechoslovakia, and there was a real puzzle as to why the Greens didn't do better in the elections there. Right after the revolution, all the parties were springing up. The Greens did too. They looked very strong. The environmental question was very large there. There was also a sense in which the Green Party, as an anti-party party, had an advantage because there was a general unwillingness to get involved with parties at all, and it looked like they would be attractive. Elections came and they didn't even register on it, and I'm curious about why that happened.
Well, frankly, we are too. There's a green coordination, but it's sometimes loose, and sometimes it's hard to know exactly what's going on. And particularly in a situation where the Greens turn out to be weak, it's particularly hard to know. They were elected in Slovakia. There were some Greens that were elected in Slovakia, but that's a little disappointing because, of course, the Czech part is the most polluted, and it's where it would have more influence. So it was a big disappointment. I have a feeling you know as much about that as I do.
There wasn't any explanation. It was just puzzling, and I thought maybe you'd have some insight.
I really don't. I really don't know. I know what happened in Hungary, but Czechoslovakia is I think to some extent that Havel has a very broad support, and there's a tendency of people who might be Greens to support Havel. I think that has something to do with it. But I really don't want to say too much because I don't know the situation very well. I know Hungary is another place that was very disappointing for the Greens because they had a strong movement there a couple of years ago against the Danube, the dam on the Danube, and the Green movement. I was in Hungary, seeing the Green movement was doing a lot of things and seemed really to be a potential force in that country. But what has happened is that a certain number of bureaucrats have gone in and grabbed the label. That's why I said the fight for the label is a problem, and expelled the ones who were the original Green activists. And the original Green activists who have the contact with the Austrian and German Greens and had politics like the German Greens and multi-issue politics have been shoved aside for very, very conventional people who don't really seem very green and haven't got any votes. But of course, another thing about Hungary is that half the population doesn't vote. And there's the working class is very, very wait and see in Hungary. They're just not participating in the political process at all. And so you don't know what's going to happen when the economic troubles deepen. And there's a lot of fear about what's going to happen, because the enthusiasm for capitalism and free enterprise is not necessarily shared by a lot of the population who is just totally silent at this point.
Is it perhaps true that these countries are more interested in putting food on the table rather than worrying about the environment? And so the parties that deal with economic issues are those that catch their attention?
Yes, that's perfectly true. That's perfectly true. But no, I wouldn't say that they deal with economic issues, because so far it's more ideological. It hasn't been bread and butter voting up to now. It's been very ideological voting. The success of the Christian Democrats is an ideological success more than anything else. And in Hungary, what has been winning out is Hungarian patriotism, Christianity, ideological values, not economical ones particularly.
I guess I would have interpreted the Christian Democratic victory as a bread and butter kind of victory.
Maybe, but the real issue is this isn't original with me, but some Hungarian analysts have pointed out that what you're getting there is a restoration of capitalism without a capitalist class. So that there's a political struggle going on to be the capitalist class. You have state-owned property that is going to be distributed. Who is going to get it? And this is why getting into power is very important, because the ones who are in power politically are going to get that, are going to become the owners. Well, to some extent, because mostly the Japanese and the Germans and others are going to become the owners. But as so far as there are local owners, it's going to be the people who are in the government. And so the real struggle then becomes very ideological, because you can't say, I'm running for office so that I can have a hunk of the state railroads or something. You have to say it's because we want Hungarian traditional values brought back, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the way the politics is operating.
How long do you expect the euphoria, I mean, it is a time of euphoria no matter what, so much has changed so immensely. How long is it going to take for, it does come down to bread and butter issues, and people realize they're not going to be living in Paris in 2 years because they got the Russian army out, but in fact they're still in Budapest, and it's not much different.
I really don't know. There's an awful lot of fear just that some kind of fascism is going to follow in large parts of Eastern Europe. By fascism, that I mean to say that there will be some demagogic leader who will combine some facets of socialism. I mean, that's what fascism was. Fascism was in places where the masses of people were disillusioned with capitalism, but in order to prevent, rather than socialism, you have something that is an authoritarian system. And there is a tremendous base for fascism today in Eastern Europe, tremendous base for it. And I think people are aware, I mean, people who think about these things are very aware of this and fearful of this, and you hope that it can be prevented. But it is a very likely option, because I say, when you see the masses of people in Hungary are not voting, it's the educated, it's the elites that decided to get rid of the system, because they wanted to live like the people that they had seen, in the West. But the masses of people haven't that hope even, and are saying nothing right now. But there can be a reaction, and what form it will take is really, really hard to tell, because it could take a very irrational form, and it's hard to predict the irrational.
How soon is that reaction likely to occur?
That again, I can't tell. Things have already gone so much faster than anybody had predicted as far as the collapse of that system that I think time measurements are all off.
I was wondering if you're talking about months or years before.
Oh, I'm thinking of not too long, because in fact, if things go on, I mean, after a while there may be a stabilization. It's really probably the next few years are the most dangerous, the next 5 or 10 years. Yes?
Yeah, probably historically speaking, if you want to draw parallels between now and Germany, it's when the economic situation of the average person probably hits rock bottom, which may be, next 2 years?
Yeah.
Something
Yeah,
like that?
yeah.
It varies tremendously from country to country.
That's another thing.
There's variety in several of these.
Exactly. The situation is already much worse in some places than in others, and so on. It's hard to tell. Also, the expectations. There are a lot of people who make dire predictions, especially about Poland and about Poland. Romania has never been in very good shape in any respect, so it's hardly even a matter of predictions. But usually people say, well, Czechoslovakia has a democratic tradition, so you hope that they'll come through better than others. It has also to do with the historic background of the countries, what way they're likely to go in a crunch.
Is there still a spark of militarism hidden in Germany that hasn't surfaced yet?
No, I don't think so. I think really and truly, I mean, that would have to be revived very nearly from scratch, which doesn't mean it couldn't happen. But I think the anti-militarism is much stronger in Germany than the militarism. As long as there are people who still remember World War II, that will be the case. Andreas von Bülow, whom I have met a number of occasions, and is a defense specialist for for the Social Democratic Party. He was a child outside Dresden in the firebombing, and he still remembers, the smell of burning flesh and things like that. And the end of the war was so terrible for Germans. It really did make an impression. And I think the anti-militarism is very, very strong in Germany. It's much stronger than in France, because France didn't lose a war in a glorious way. I mean, Germany did, you see. They did the best they could, and they were totally defeated. And the idea the war just doesn't work is very, very strong. Whereas the French lost, but then came out on the winning side, and they sort of want to assert themselves. And so there's much more militarism there, but I don't know that it's a threat to anybody. I'm just saying the attitudes are there.
We got one more question first.
I have another question back there.
Could you say a little bit more about the radical democracy, the emphasis on action, the Greens? What sort of issues are currently dealing with, whether it includes workplace issues?
It particularly, actually, it doesn't very much because of the social composition of this movement. It is really not a labor movement. And I say the whole problem of the relations of the Greens to the labor movement is, I think, one of the unsolved problems that will determine the future of the movement. Right now, they tend to emphasize rights for immigrants, anti-racism, rights of asylum. That's their main.
Where does Austria fit in all this?
Well, it is a candidate for the EC. The Greens are against